When I saw the body stretched out on the forest floor, the first thing I realized was this: no one should ever find that. It wasn't fear in the usual sense, not an instant jolt of shock. It was something deeper, almost physical, like I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. The air felt too heavy to breathe, the silence wasn't natural, and for a few seconds, I just stood there, unable to take a single step, trying to figure out if it was really in front of me, or if my mind was inventing something to fill a void that should never have been touched. The body was too big, too still, too real for any simple explanation, and at the same time, it was wrong in a way I'd never felt before. Nothing about that scene fit into the world the way I knew it. There were no animal sounds, no wind, no life reacting to that presence. It was like the forest itself was refusing to look, and in that instant, before I could even think it through, I knew this wasn't a discovery. It was a mistake. Mistake that someone, at some point, was going to pay for. Before I go on, I need to ask you for something simple but important. Subscribe to the channel right now. Not because it changes my life, but because it makes sure you'll stay with this story all the way to the end. And find the others 2 stories told the same way, like real confessions, quiet, raw, and hard to say out loud. You don't hear this kind of account everywhere, and every subscription helps keep this space alive so stories like this can exist without being twisted, mocked, or turned into a spectacle. It took me a while to understand what I was really looking at, because my mind was desperate to force it into something familiar. An injured animal, an abandoned body, a hallucination from exhaustion. Anything that didn't require me to admit what my eyes were seeing. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became that it wasn't just something dead. It was something that should never have been there, exposed, vulnerable, reduced to a body on the ground. There was a strange weight to that sight, like watching it was, somehow, an intrusion. I felt like I didn't have the right to be there, like that moment wasn't meant to be witnessed. And still, I was alone, with no one to share the responsibility of what came next. Maybe you're thinking this is just another strange story, another impossible account, another attempt to get attention. I'd think the same thing if I were on the other side. But there's a point where doubt stops feeling safe and starts to itch under your skin. And that's exactly where I found myself. Because it didn't feel like a legend. It didn't feel like an idea. It didn't feel far away. It felt like consequences. It felt like the result of something that had gone wrong long before that moment. And the more I watched, the more I felt like that death wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that was still going to unfold, with me at the center of it, whether I wanted to be or not. While you're listening, I want you to write in the comments where you're watching from. City, state, country. It doesn't matter where you are right now, because this story doesn't belong to just one place. It connects different people in different regions who felt that same unease. The moment you realize the world might be bigger, more complicated, and crueler than we like to admit. Seeing those comments matters, because it proves this isn't isolated. It isn't just me. And there are echoes of it out there. What hit me hardest in that moment wasn't the size of the body, or its shape, or the details I'm not going to describe yet. It was the lack of an explanation. The feeling that any step I took from that point on would carry permanent weight. I could leave and pretend I'd never seen anything. I could try to understand what was there. I could do something that would change not only my life, but other people's too. And the most disturbing part was realizing none of those options felt right. Every one of them carried consequences I still couldn't measure. The forest stayed silent, like it was waiting, not for help, for a decision. I didn't know how long it had been since that body ended up there, or what had happened before it, but something inside me said that death wasn't natural. Not in the biological sense, but in the moral sense. There were signs it shouldn't have ended that way, like there was a whole story that didn't get to finish the way it was meant to. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt like finding it hadn't been random. It was the consequence of human choices, direct or indirect, choices that never considered the real cost of crossing certain lines. If you stay with me to the end of this video, you'll understand why nothing made sense after that. You'll understand why I never looked at a forest the same way again. You'll understand why some truths, when they surface, don't set you free, don't clarify anything, don't bring peace. They only expose how small we are in the face of what insists on existing beyond our sight. And most of all, you'll understand why, even now, I still don't know if I should be telling you this. Because everything that happened after that moment started right there, in front of a body that shouldn't have existed, and a decision I still haven't had the courage to forget. The longer I stood there, the harder it became to hold on to any simple explanation. At first, my mind clung to familiar paths, almost on autopilot, like it was trying to protect me from what was too obvious to accept. A big animal, maybe, a rare species, a mistake caused by exhaustion. But all it took was one more look for those ideas to fall apart. The proportions didn't follow the logic of any animal I'd ever seen, not even from a distance. The torso was wide in a strange way. The limbs were too long for the body, and there was an unsettling symmetry, something that felt intentional, structured, not purely instinct. It wasn't grotesque. It was organized. And that made it worse. When I noticed the hands, something twisted in my stomach in a way that's still hard to explain. They weren't paws. They weren't claws. They were hands. Big, heavy, but hands. Defined fingers, visible joints, a position that suggested rest, not stiffness. Even in death, there was something about that posture that felt aware, like the body had been left behind by whatever lived inside it, but not brutalized by the fall. I stepped back without even realizing it, because in that moment I understood I was looking at something that occupied a space far closer to human than I ever wanted to admit. I avoided looking at the face for a while, not out of direct fear, but because I had a clear intuition that if I looked, something inside me would change. When I finally did, I didn't find ferocity or frozen rage or that animal expression movies and stories like to force onto things they don't understand. What I saw was neutrality, a strange stillness. The mouth slightly open, the eyes shut, the features unmoving as if the creature had simply stopped. It didn't look like a predator that had been taken down. It looked like someone who lost something before they lost their life, and that didn't bring instant empathy. It brought moral discomfort. At that point, I wasn't trying to figure out what it was anymore. I was trying to figure out what it meant. Because there's a huge difference between finding something unknown and finding something that challenges the line we use to feel safe in the world. It didn't fit the category of animal, but it didn't fit the idea of a monster either. Monsters, in a way, are comforting. They justify fear. This didn't justify anything. It only complicated it. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like calling it a creature or a thing was a coward's way of avoiding the real problem. If you've ever looked at something and realized the explanation matters less than what it implies, then maybe you understand what started to weigh on me in that moment. It wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about responsibility. Because if it wasn't an animal, then someone had died there in a way that never should have happened. And if it wasn't a monster, then the story we tell ourselves to feel safe had been wrong from the start. If this is making sense to you so far, write one simple word in the comments. I get it. It helps me know you're following this line of thought, because from here on out, it gets heavier. There were marks on the body that didn't match a predator attack. No chaotic tearing, no uncontrolled bites. What I saw were signs of wear, like that body had been pushed hard for a long time. Small old scars, thicker patches of skin, marks that didn't look recent. It spoke of survival, adaptation, someone who'd lived in that environment for years, maybe decades. And that realization brought a thought I tried to shove away. Immediately, if it had lived there that long, it wasn't alone. And if it wasn't alone, then that death wasn't an isolated event. I started to realize how comfortable the word animal really is. It absolves us. Animals die. Animals are found. Animals are part of the cycle. But this didn't fit that simple cycle. There was a presence there that demanded a different reading, a different kind of respect, even if I didn't want to give it. And maybe that's what bothers people most when they hear a story like this. The idea that something can exist in the world that doesn't fit our labels. but also can't just be dismissed as fantasy. As I watched, one part of me wanted to document everything, to lock every detail into memory, because I had a strange feeling it wouldn't stay there for long, like the scene was temporary, fragile, about to be interrupted. Another part of me wanted to leave immediately, erase it from my mind, pretend it never happened. That split is something few people admit. They feel, but it shows up whenever we run into something that threatens our most basic certainty. If you've ever felt that in your life, comment, "I have," because it connects this story to experiences that are more common than they seem. What disturbed me most was realizing that even while I tried to rationalize it, my body reacted before my mind did. My breathing shifted, my muscles tightened, like I was being watched, assessed. Not by the body, obviously, but by something I couldn't see. And that's when an idea began to form, slow and unsettling. Maybe this wasn't just a body someone happened to find. Maybe it was a warning, not in some mystical sense, but in the simplest and most brutal sense possible. A warning that something there had been broken. I still didn't know how, or by who, or why. But the certainty that it wasn't a normal animal came with a responsibility I never asked for. Because once you realize something is closer to you than it should be, ignoring it stops being neutral. Ignoring it becomes a choice. And choices, I learned very quickly, don't go unanswered. The world around me seemed to confirm that, because nothing moved, nothing reacted, like everything was suspended, waiting for the next step. Maybe as you're listening, you're trying to decide which side you're on, whether this is just an exaggerated story, or whether there's something here that touches an uncomfortable truth. I'm not going to ask you to believe me. Not yet. What I'm asking is that you stay with me, because what started as a physical, visual, undeniable reality quickly became something much bigger. That first certainty that it wasn't an animal was only the first step. What came next involved silence, wrong choices, and a realization that some deaths don't close stories. They open doors that never shut again. In the very next moment, something started to bother me, even more than the body itself. That's when I realized the forest wasn't reacting. There was no usual sound of leaves shifting in the wind, no distant birdsong, no insects, no branch snapping somewhere off in the distance. It was a thick, heavy silence that didn't feel natural. Anyone who's lived near the woods or spent time in deep forest knows absolute silence doesn't happen out there. There's always motion, always life making itself known, even quietly. But in that moment, everything felt suspended, like the whole place was holding its breath with me. It didn't scare me right away. It put me on, alert, and there's a big difference between fear and alertness. Fear freezes you. Alertness warns you. I started noticing details that would have slipped past me before. The feel of the air on my skin, the slightly colder temperature around that exact spot, the way my own footsteps sounded too loud in that emptiness. Every small movement I made felt inappropriate, almost offensive. I had the clear impression I was breaking an unwritten rule, something basic, like speaking too loudly in a place where someone is sleeping. There was nothing visible around me, but there was presence. Not in a supernatural way, not as something mystical or overblown, but like a kind of awareness spread out through the trees, focused, attentive, watching without showing itself. The longer I stayed there, the stronger that feeling became. It wasn't like being followed. It was like being evaluated, like every gesture I made was being recorded, weighed, interpreted. It messes with your head in a way few experiences do, because there's no clear reaction, no direct threat, nothing to fight and nothing to run from. Just the certainty that you're not alone, even if you can't point to where the other one is. And that certainty made me rethink every choice, every step, every second I remained there. Maybe you felt something like that at some point in your life, even far from any forest. That feeling of being watched without proof, of something being wrong, even when everything looks normal on the surface. If that's happened to you, write the word silence in the comment. That word holds more than it seems, because silence isn't the absence of sound. Sometimes it's an excess of attention, and that's exactly what I felt in that moment. I tried to convince myself it was just an exaggerated emotional reaction, a side effect of the shock. The brain hunts for familiar patterns to calm itself down. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more my body did the opposite. My shoulders tightened. My breathing stayed shallow. My senses were too sharp. It was like something inside me was screaming not to let my guard down. And that kind of reaction doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from something old and instinctive, something that recognizes danger before your mind can explain it. The strangest part was that the silence didn't feel hostile. There was no sense of an imminent attack, no aggression. It was a silence loaded with expectation, like something was waiting for a decision from me. That made it even heavier, because it put the entire responsibility on my shoulders. There was no one to share that moment with, no one to confirm what I was feeling, no one to split the judgment. It was just me, that body, and a forest that somehow felt aware of what was happening. I started to notice that in certain spots around me, the ground was marked differently. Not like normal animal trails, but like paths that had been avoided. Areas where the vegetation looked less disturbed, as if something large had taken care not to make itself obvious. It might sound like an irrelevant detail, but anyone who watches nature learns fast how to tell accident from habit. And this felt like habit, a pattern of behavior that didn't scream for attention, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. By then, my mind was far from the curiosity I'd started with. Whatever existed there didn't want to be seen. That was clear not through words, but through absence. Absence of noise, of movement, of any sign that would give a presence away. And that's something people rarely talk about when they tell stories like this. Most narratives exaggerate, dramatize, turn everything into spectacle. Real life, when it happens, is much more restrained, much more quiet. And maybe that's why it's so hard to explain to someone who's never felt it. As I stayed there, I had the impression that this silence hadn't started with me. Like it was a direct response to that body on the ground. Like something in the place had shifted because of what had happened. It wasn't just my discomfort. The entire forest felt knocked off balance. And that brought a deeply unsettling thought. Maybe that death had broken some kind of equilibrium. Not a mystical one, but territorial, behavioral, invisible to anyone who doesn't live close enough to notice. If you're still with me at this point, comment, "I'm here." It helps keep the story alive in the algorithm. And more than that, it shows you're feeling the weight of this progression. Because what comes next isn't immediate. It isn't explosive. It's slow. It's psychological. It's the kind of thing that seeps in and changes how you see everything around you. Time felt warped inside that silence. I couldn't tell if minutes had passed or seconds. Every moment felt longer than it should have. And the longer I stayed there, the more I felt like my presence was being tolerated, not accepted. There's a big difference between those two states. Being tolerated means there's an invisible boundary, and that boundary can be crossed if you push too far. And I started to feel like I was dangerously close to it. That's when the idea of leaving stopped being just an option and became a necessity, not out of direct fear, but out of respect. Something there was asking for distance, not verbally, not explicitly, but with a clarity that was hard to ignore. And at the same time, something kept me anchored to that spot, like leaving without understanding even a little. More would mean carrying an even heavier weight afterward. That internal contradiction is cruel. It pins you between two possible mistakes and offers no comfortable choice. I took a few slow steps, not running, but backing away deliberately. And even then, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. It seemed to adjust to my movement, like something tracked every shift I made, always just outside my line of sight. There was no sound of pursuit, no shadow moving through the trees, none of that. Just the certainty that I wasn't the only one there, capable of making a decision. If there's one word that defines that moment, it's vigilance. Not aggressive, not curious focused. And that vigilance made me understand something fundamental. That body on the ground wasn't just an isolated death. It was part of something larger, something I still couldn't see in full. The silence in the forest wasn't grief. It was restraint. And that restraint was a warning that any wrong move from that point on would have consequences I wasn't ready to face. As I allowed myself to look more closely, something shifted inside me. The body stopped being just an unsettling presence on the ground and started to show signs of a life that hadn't ended there. There were no obvious clues like clothing or objects, but the body itself carried the marks of time. Some areas of skin were thicker, not as instinctive armor, but as the result of years of adaptation. Old scars ran across the jaw, torso and arms injuries that didn't look fresh, that had healed long ago, the kind that only form after a long recovery. It didn't speak of a single incident. It spoke of ongoing survival. Those marks didn't look like the result of constant fights or chaotic attacks. If anything, there was a logic to them, as if each injury had been the consequence of choices made over time. Some scars were small, almost subtle, but placed in ways that suggested repeated strain, maybe work, maybe protection. Others were deeper, old enough to have become part of the body, no longer something separate from it. It made me realize this being had lived long before that moment, had been through hard things, had endured. That death wasn't a random accident. It was the end of a long trajectory. I started noticing details I would have ignored completely before. The way the body lay on the ground didn't look like the result of a violent fall or a sudden attack. There was a kind of involuntary order to it, as if it had lowered itself down or finally given in to exhaustion. It's hard to explain without sounding like I'm assigning human intent, but I'm not. It was simply the fact that there were no signs of a struggle right there. Nothing smashed up around it, no vegetation crushed beyond what made sense. It suggested the end came quietly, maybe after a long decline, maybe far from direct conflict. That realization stirred something I didn't expect to feel: respect. Not blind admiration, not romanticizing, but respect for the idea that this being had occupied that space for a long time without being seen, without being noticed, without interfering. And when something lives that way on the edge, avoiding contact death carries a different kind of weight. It isn't only the end of a life. It's the interruption of an equilibrium that held itself together through silence. If this is making sense to you, write the word story in the comments, because that's exactly what started forming in my mind, a story cut short. There were also subtle signs of care in the body itself. The most sensitive areas seemed preserved, protected over time. That doesn't happen by accident. In a harsh environment, only those who learn self-preservation survive, those who understand limits, who avoid unnecessary risks. This wasn't a being that exposed itself on impulse. It was something that knew the territory, knew where to step, when to move, when to disappear. And that reinforced an idea. I was still resisting. If it had lived that way for so long, it wasn't living only for itself. A sense of age began to take shape, even though I couldn't put a number to it. It wasn't young, that much was clear. The body carried signs of accumulated wear, not weakness, but constant use. Like someone who'd crossed many seasons, many winters, maybe many losses. It made me think about how much had happened in that same space without me or any other human ever noticing. How many times it watched from a distance. How many decisions it made not to be seen. How many routes it avoided to protect something bigger than itself. And then the heaviest thought yet landed in me. If it had lived there that long, it probably wasn't alone. That idea didn't arrive as instant fear, but as simple logic. No species, no intelligent group survives in isolation for that long without some kind of structure. That doesn't mean a visible community or complex organization, but bonds, the presence of others, continuity, and that realization completely changed the way I looked at that body. It wasn't just someone who had died. It was someone who had left something behind. If you've ever felt that internal shift, looking at something simple and suddenly realizing there's far more there than it seems, comment, turning point, because that's exactly what happened to me. The scene stopped being merely unsettling and became morally heavy. I wasn't standing in front of a curious mystery anymore. I was standing in front of consequences, and consequences rarely arrive alone. The more I studied it, the more I realized I hadn't found that death by chance. Not in the sense of fate or a higher plan, but in timing. Something had failed somewhere in that being's survival. Maybe age, maybe illness, maybe something outside of it that hadn't revealed itself yet. But the fact that it was there, Exposed meant something that had always worked had stopped working. And when a long-standing pattern breaks, the impact spreads. Began to feel a growing discomfort, not physical, but emotional. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't ordinary sadness. It was the feeling of being too close to something intimate, like stepping into a private space without permission. That death didn't ask for an audience. It didn't ask to be recorded. It didn't ask to be interpreted. And still, I was there, taking it in, carrying a weight I didn't know how to process. If any of this hits you, write "wait" in the comments. Because some stories don't. Scream, they weigh you down. At that point, the idea of simply walking away started to get complicated. Not because I thought I had some heroic duty, but because leaving without understanding, even a little more, felt disrespectful. Like turning my back would mean ignoring everything that body was saying without words. And at the same time, staying too long began to feel dangerous, not because of a direct threat, but because of exposure. Like every extra second increased the chance of crossing an invisible boundary. I realized I wasn't just watching with my eyes anymore. My mind was trying to reconstruct fragments of a life it never knew, not out of empty curiosity, but out of a need for context. What had lived there for so long? What did it protect? What did it avoid? What did it lose before it lost its own life? Those questions didn't come as panic, but as an internal quiet that demanded attention. And the more I connected to those ideas, the clearer it became that the story didn't end there. The forest around me stayed strangely restrained, as if it respected that moment, or as if it was suspended for a reason I still didn't understand. The body now wasn't just something that shouldn't exist. It was proof that something had existed for a long time without being seen. And that changes everything, because when something like that disappears, the emptiness doesn't go unnoticed by whatever is part of that system. And it was that sense of an oncoming emptiness that started to disturb me more than any direct fear. From there, everything I felt began to organize itself around a decision I didn't want to make. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't traumatic in the classic sense. It was a slow pressure, almost rational, that started to take up space in my mind. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. The body was there, real, solid, impossible to erase from memory. And at the same time, any movement I made away from that place meant carrying that existence with me. That's when the choice appeared, not as a clear option, but as a deadlock. My first thought was to call someone. Authorities, researchers, anyone who might know what to do with something like this. On the surface, it sounded logical, almost responsible. But the more I thought about it, the heavier it became. Not because I was afraid of not being believed, but because I understood exactly what happens when something outside the ordinary gets exposed. It becomes an object. It becomes evidence. It becomes a fight. People show up not to understand, but to control, to exploit, to destroy if they have to. And in that situation, one death wouldn't end anything. It would start something much bigger, much more invasive. My second thought was to record it. Take pictures, shoot video, document every detail as proof, as personal protection. But that carried a different kind of weight. Evidence isn't neutral. Evidence spreads. Evidence slips out of the hands of the person who creates it. And once it's out, there's no pulling it back. I thought about how many stories begin like that, someone believing they're doing the right thing, and end in exposure, in pursuit, in the destruction of everything that had survived in silence. Recording it wouldn't be just keeping a memory. It would be signing a contract I didn't know how it would end. The third option was the hardest to admit, because it sounded like the most cowardly one at first. Hide it, leave, don't tell anyone, don't show anyone. Let that body follow the natural course of the place it had always belonged to. From the outside, it looked like the wrong choice. But inside, it was the only choice that didn't put me at the center of something that clearly wasn't about me. And still, hiding is also an action. Doing nothing is a decision. And decisions, I was already starting to understand, come with a price. As I weighed those options, one thing became clear. There was no choice without loss. Any path meant sacrificing something: my peace, my safety, my integrity, or something much bigger than me. This is the kind of dilemma nobody prepares you for, because it doesn't show up in manuals or in neat, comforting stories. It shows up when you cross an invisible boundary and realize you're no longer a spectator. If you can feel that pressure, write "no way out" in the comments, because that's exactly how it felt. The most agonizing part was realizing that decision wouldn't affect only me. There was an invisible chain tied to that body. Others who might have depended on it. Others who might react to its absence. Others who could suffer direct consequences if it was revealed. And I didn't have enough information to measure the reach of any of it. I was being forced to choose in the dark, using only instinct, limited experience, and a moral compass that was starting to wobble under pressure. I stepped back a few paces, trying to create distance so I could think more clearly, but it only expanded the sense of responsibility. It was like every foot between me and the body didn't lighten the weight, it spread it. The forest remained too quiet, like it was following my internal struggle. And the more I reflected, the more I realized this choice wasn't only about what to do with the body. It was about what kind of person I would become after I walked away. Calling someone meant giving up control. Recording it meant creating something that could never be undone. Hiding it meant carrying a secret that would never fully belong to me. There was no clean option, no comfortable ending. And that's something people don't like to admit. Some situations don't offer redemption. They only ask you to choose which scar you're willing to live with. If you've ever faced something like that, even in a different context, comment "scar," because some marks don't show on the outside. Time kept moving, and urgency started to push in. I knew staying there much longer increased the risks. Someone could show up. Something could shift in the environment. That quiet window wouldn't stay open forever. I had to choose soon, even if the choice was incomplete, even if it was wrong. And that made me realize something even more unsettling. I wasn't choosing what was right. I was choosing what was least destructive in that moment. My mind searched for justifications, arguments that would make one option more acceptable than the others. But all of them felt fragile when placed against the real impact of what was at stake. This wasn't about proving something existed. It was about preserving or breaking a silence that had been held for a long time. And in that place, silence wasn't ignorance. It was survival. As I stood there, I started to feel like that choice hadn't appeared by accident in that exact moment. It was as if everything I'd sensed up to then, the forest silence, the marks on the body, the feeling of vigilance, was converging into this decision. Like this was the point where a human has to decide whether to respect what they don't understand or try to dominate it just to feel safe. If you're still following this story at this point, comment "I'm in." It shows you understand this isn't about easy curiosity or entertainment. What came after that choice wasn't immediate. It wasn't explosive, but it was irreversible. Because the moment I finally leaned my thinking toward one side, something changed inside me. Not in the environment, not in the body in front of me, but in the way I began to see my own presence there. And that change was quiet, permanent, and far heavier than I expected. Once the decision took shape inside me, everything got heavier. There was no relief, no feeling that I'd done the right thing. What came was a different kind of silence, more internal, harder to ignore. I didn't tell anyone. Not that day, and not in the days that followed. And what most people don't understand is that silence isn't empty. It takes up space. It seeps in. It collects its due. From the moment I walked away, from that place carrying nothing but the memory, something changed in the way I existed in the world. Fear didn't hit like instant panic. It showed up as a constant companion. A low, steady noise in my head that never shut off. I caught myself being too tuned in to ordinary sounds, watching movements I would have ignored before, measuring my words before I said anything, even when the conversation had nothing to do with what I'd lived through. It was like the secret had grown roots and started spreading inside me. The harder I tried to keep up a normal routine, the more fake everything felt. Conversations were shallow, commitments were automatic, and I had this sense I was always one step out of place. The paranoia settled in quietly. It wasn't wild suspicion of everyone and everything, but a constant state of surveillance. I watched who lingered too close, who asked questions that sounded too harmless, who stared too long at the tree line without even knowing why. Any offhand comment about something strange, any vague news story, any badly explained rumor made my blood run cold. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, and it's exhausting. Living on high alert wears you down more than the initial shock of any traumatic event. The hardest thing to live with was the guilt. Not the kind you can name easily, not clean and obvious, but diffuse guilt spread out everywhere. Guilt for seeing it, guilt for leaving, guilt for not telling anyone, guilt for telling only myself. Kept asking, without ever saying it out loud, whether silence was actually protecting anyone, or if it was just a way to protect myself from what would happen if the truth got loose. And that question never fully settled. It stayed there, spinning, resurfacing at random moments, especially when I tried to sleep. If you've ever carried a secret too big to share, right? I carry it in the comments. You don't have to explain. Just that phrase says enough, because secrets like that don't sit in a neat little drawer in your mind. They spread through everything. They affect your mood, your choices, your relationships. Little by little, I started pulling away from people without even realizing it. Not out of arrogance or contempt, but because it was easier to stay quiet than to explain why I was always distant, tense, distracted. There was also the constant fear that I'd made an irreversible mistake. Not regret in the immediate sense, but the awareness that silence is a choice you can't easily undo. Once you make it, it stretches forward in time. Every day that passed made it harder to break, and the longer time moved on, the more that decision became part of who I was. It creates a specific kind of isolation. You don't just feel alone. You feel separated, like you're living on a different layer of reality. Sometimes I got the impression the world around me reacted to that silence. Not in a supernatural way, but in behavior. The forest felt farther away, less welcoming. Places that used to calm me started to make me uneasy. I avoided certain paths, avoided certain hours, avoided being alone for too long, even though I'd always been fine with my own company. The secret started dictating routes, small choices, daily habits. And that's something people rarely connect, not telling. Silence rearranges your life. That feeling of being watched didn't vanish after I left that place. It changed shape. Before, it was outside me. Now, it was inside. I watched myself, constantly policing thoughts, replaying decisions, trying to predict consequences that might never come. That kind of self-surveillance is draining. It eats at your energy, your attention, your presence. You're always slightly elsewhere, even when you're physically there. And it creates a distance the people around you feel, even if they can't put words to it. If this is resonating with you, comment constant wait, because that's the best way to describe what came next. The initial shock faded, the image blurred with time, but the wait stayed. It showed up in broken dreams, in sudden wake-ups, in moments of absolute quiet where the only thing I could hear was my own breathing speeding up. It wasn't terror. It was wear and tear. And prolonged wear and tear changes people in deep ways. I started to understand that protecting something can also destroy the one doing the protecting. Not all at once, not in a dramatic crash, but slowly through small internal compromises. You stop sharing. You stop trusting. You stop letting yourself fully rest. Because underneath it all, there's always that feeling that if anything leaks, if even one piece shifts out of place, everything can collapse. And living like that demands a high price, even when nobody else sees it. There were moments I almost broke the silence. Small impulses, quick thoughts, the idea that maybe sharing it would lighten the load. But then the reminder of what was at stake would hit. Not just for me, but for everything that silence was protecting. That reminder worked like an immediate break. Every time I pulled back, I felt a brief relief followed by an even heavier weight. Because the decision got reaffirmed, and reaffirming silence is like reinforcing a wall that separates you from the rest of the world. Over time, I began to realize that secret had become part of my identity. Not something I showed, but something that shaped my reactions. The way I looked at similar stories, my patience with other people's curiosity, my resistance to turning mystery into entertainment. I got harder in some places, more sensitive in others, and I kept wondering if the price I was paying was truly necessary or simply inevitable. If you're following this closely, right, still here, it tells me you understand this story isn't about one single moment, but about a process. The silence didn't end when I left the forest. It started there. And from that beginning, it spread into parts of my life I never expected it to touch. The secret stopped being something I kept. It became something that kept me drawing lines around how far I could go, how close I could get, how much I could forget. And it was exactly when I started to think I'd learned how to live with that weight that something outside of me changed. Not abruptly, not with clear signs, but with small shifts in the world around me. Subtle things, almost imperceptible, that suggested the silence wasn't just an individual choice. It was being watched, and somehow answered. After that day, nothing changed overnight, and maybe that was the most disturbing part. The changes came slowly, almost politely, like reality was testing how far it could move without drawing attention. At first, it was casual remarks, things that would usually pass without anyone noticing. Someone saying they'd heard different sounds at night. Someone else mentioning trails that seemed more used than they should be, for no obvious reason. They weren't alarmist reports or exaggerated stories. They were ordinary observations, said in passing, but to me, they sounded like pieces of something bigger starting to shift. The forest felt different too, not in an obvious way, but in its overall behavior. Certain areas were avoided more by smaller animals. Other places started showing signs of more frequent movement, always away from human roots. I noticed it without even looking for it, and that made it worse. It was like the environment was reorganizing its self-adjusting boundaries, redefining territory, and I couldn't shake the feeling that death had been the starting point of that quiet change. Over time, the reports got harder to ignore. People who used to move through the area started avoiding certain hours. Some said they felt watched, even though they never saw anything. Others talked about a constant sense of alertness in specific stretches, like something was always just outside their peripheral vision. These stories weren't told with open fear, but with discomfort. And collective discomfort rarely appears for no reason. If you've ever noticed changes like that in a place you know well, comment, change. Sometimes the environment speaks before people do. What bothered me most was the repetition. These weren't isolated events. Patterns were forming, trails used only at night, marks that appeared and vanished without clear logic. The silence returning at specific times, always thicker, always more concentrated. Didn't need to be there to feel it. All I had to do was listen to what people said, connect the dots, realize something was shifting, adjusting routes, responding to an absence. The death hadn't closed anything. It had triggered something that had been waiting. Alongside that, there were vague reports that were hard to confirm. People who didn't come back from hikes. Disappearances explained away as accidents, disorientation, human error. Nothing big enough to spark extensive searches or deep investigations. But when you line those points up, a shape starts to form, and the shape wasn't chaotic. It was directed. It didn't bring immediate fear. It brought the certainty that the silence I'd kept was being accompanied by something beyond me. That sense of vigilance intensified, not just in the areas near the forest, but in me. I started noticing small signs I would have dismissed as coincidence before. Objects not where I left them. Brief sounds that stopped the moment I tried to focus. The impression that someone or something knew my habits better than it should have. It didn't feel like a direct threat. It felt like constant presence. Like I'd been marked simply for crossing that boundary and making the choice I made. If you can feel this escalation, comment trigger, because that's exactly what that death became. A quiet trigger, no explosion, no spectacle, but long reach. The changes didn't need a direct confrontation to be real. They spread like waves, shaping behavior, routines, decisions. People started drifting away from the region without being able to say exactly why. Others stayed, but changed their hours, their routes, their posture. The environment was teaching something, and not everyone realized it consciously. I also began to notice that some parts of the forest felt more protected, almost as if they were being respected by something larger. There were no signs of devastation, no aggression. If anything, there was restraint, clear, invisible limits that weren't crossed casually. That reinforced the idea that this wasn't a frenzy or disorganized behavior. It was response, and responses tend to match what was lost. The most unsettling part was realizing nobody connected these events directly. Everyone saw only their piece, a strange sound, a path avoided, a silence at the wrong time. I, on the other hand, could see the whole line forming because I carried the starting point inside me. And that position is lonely. You watch while others only feel. You understand while others only react. And you can't explain without breaking something you decided to preserve. There were moments I wondered if all of it was just my mind exaggerating an after effect of the secret and the guilt. But that idea fell apart every time someone, without knowing anything, described the exact same feeling I carried, the same discomfort, the same impression of being evaluated, the same difficulty staying quiet too long out there. When the same experience repeats, in different people, a purely personal explanation stops being enough. If you're following the pattern, comment "not an accident," because that's what settles in when enough points pile up. That death had changed something fundamental, not just for me, but for an entire system that had been running quietly until then. And when systems get interrupted, they reorganize in ways that don't ask permission. Over time, the idea that death had been a warning began to take shape. Not a warning telling humans to stay away out of fear, but a warning that something essential had been removed. A guardian, maybe. A point of balance. And when that point disappears, what follows isn't immediate chaos, but adjustment. Adjustment of boundaries, of behavior, of presence. And that adjustment, even when quiet, is relentless. I could feel the forest wasn't only watching anymore. It was reacting, not against specific people, but against ongoing intrusion, against excessive curiosity, against the human urge to make everything something we can manage. That death had exposed a weakness, and that weakness was being corrected from the inside out, without noise. The more I noticed those changes, the clearer it became that the silence I'd kept wasn't being ignored. It was being recognized. And that brings a different kind of weight. Not guilt's weight, but the weight of being included in something bigger without ever asking to be. The constant vigilance didn't feel like punishment. It felt like monitoring, like my future actions still mattered to whatever was unfolding. If you've made it this far, write "watching," because this story doesn't speed up, it deepens. What got triggered didn't resolve in days or weeks. It kept showing up quiet, persistent, like a constant reminder that the death I found hadn't been an isolated event. And as all of that played out around me, I started to understand the real impact was still ahead. Not in the environment, not in other people, but in how time would eventually collect on what had been set in motion in that silence. Years passed, but what happened that day never stayed behind. Time moved forward, routines changed, people came and went in my life, but that experience remained like a fixed point. Something, everything afterward, had to bend around. It wasn't the kind of trauma that explodes once and then fades. It was quieter, more persistent, a constant presence shaping choices. Without announcing it was doing so. Little by little, I realized I didn't decide the same way anymore. I weighed risk differently. I avoided certain topics, certain places, certain conversations that would have never bothered me before. I never went back to that place. Not out of direct fear, but out of understanding. There was a strange clarity that returning would mean crossing a boundary I'd already respected once. And respecting that boundary became part of who I was. Even when curiosity surfaced, even when memory insisted, something stronger held my steps. It spilled into other parts of my life, too. I started pulling away from situations that demanded unnecessary exposure, avoiding conflicts that led nowhere, stepping back from opportunities that asked for more than I was willing to pay emotionally. Some people noticed the change. Others drifted away without understanding. Relationships became shorter, less deep, not because I didn't care, but because an invisible barrier formed that I didn't even realize I'd built. It's hard to open up completely when you carry something you can't share. Trust develops layers, and very few people ever get close enough to pass through them. It doesn't happen dramatically. It happens in small gestures, in long pauses, in vague answers that replace truths too complicated to say. If you've ever felt like one event rewired the way you live, comment, "It marked me." Because some experiences don't need to repeat to keep working on you. They shape how you respond to the world. I started paying more attention to what wasn't said, what lived between the lines, how people behaved when they believed nobody was watching. It didn't make me suspicious of everyone. It made me more aware. And constant awareness is tiring. Over the years, my dreams changed. Not obvious nightmares, not replaying the original scene, but fragments, feelings of vigilance, of waiting, of heavy silence. Waking up with the sense something was off, even when everything looked normal. It didn't happen all the time, but when it did, it carried the reminder that the story wasn't fully closed, at least not inside me. The body forgets slower than the mind. There were major decisions in my life that were directly shaped by that event, even though nobody knew it. Route changes, refusals that looked strange from the outside, choices more cautious in some ways, more drastic in others. I began to value anonymity in a way that had never made sense before. The idea of being noticed, exposed, watched out of someone else's. Curiosity started to bother me deeply, not because of paranoia, but because I understood what happens when something stops being invisible. Even the forest, as a concept, changed for me. Not just that place, but any wild space carried an extra layer of meaning. It wasn't scenery anymore. It was territory. Living space, governed by rules that aren't written down, but are real. I stopped seeing nature as neutral, passive, available. I started seeing it as something that watches back, that responds. Over time, that doesn't easily forget sudden intrusions. It changed my posture, my behavior, even the way I walked through certain places. If that shift in perspective makes sense to you, comment "never the same," because some experiences don't allow you to return to who you were before. You can't unsee it, can't unknow it, can't go back to an innocence you crossed through. And that isn't necessarily bad, but it is permanent. I was never the same person after that day, even if nobody around me could point to exactly when the change happened. The strangest part is that, over time, the image of the body itself lost sharpness. Visual details blurred and broke apart, but the feeling stayed intact. The sense that I'd touched something that shouldn't be exposed, that I'd been present in a moment that didn't belong to me. That feeling became an internal filter. Before acting, I thought about the long-term impact. Before speaking, I thought about what could be triggered. It didn't make me wiser in some classic, comforting way. It made me more careful. People came into my life after that event and never knew the version of me from before. For them, that caution was just who I was. For older people, the change was noticeable, but impossible to explain. There were separations that hurt, not because of fights, but because of incompatible pace. When you carry a silence that's too big, other people's hurry starts to irritate you. Small talk becomes exhausting. Unnecessary exposure feels unbearable, and it creates a distance that isn't always understood. If you've ever felt isolated on the inside while still surrounded by people, comment "isolation," because that kind of distance doesn't show up in photos, can't be explained in a few lines, but it reshapes everything. I learned to live with it, but I never learned to fully neutralize it. Some days the weight feels lighter, almost gone. Other days it comes back hard, triggered by something simple, a headline, a similar account, an image that wakes up memories I wanted to keep asleep. I never returned to that place, and I never had to work very hard to justify it to myself. It was like the decision had been made on that day, even if I only understood it years later. Some doors don't slam when they close. They just stop existing, and insisting on searching for them is a waste of time and energy. I accepted that, even without fully understanding all the implications. As time went on, it became clear that what I lived wasn't just an isolated event in my personal history. It was a pivot point, a quiet but deep before and after. Everything that came later had to adjust to this new way of seeing, of feeling, of deciding. And even years later, even with life moving forward, there was always the sense that something was still pending. Not in the outside world, but inside me. That unfinished feeling didn't show up as urgency. It showed up as waiting. Waiting without a date, without a clear shape, but constant. Like the story still had something to demand, something to reveal, something to collect. I didn't know what. I only knew the impact of that day hadn't ended when I left the forest. It had stretched through time, shaping who I became, what I avoided, what I preserved. If you're still with me, right? Time. Because that's the word that defines this phase best. Time didn't erase it. It deepened it. And as the years passed, I started to understand that some stories don't end when they seem to end. They keep moving in silence, waiting for the moment when everything that was held back has to be faced in some way. As time went on, a perception began to settle with more clarity than any comfortable conclusion. It didn't arrive all at once, not like a dramatic revelation. It formed slowly, built from everything that happened after that day, everything that shifted without announcing itself, everything that had to be adjusted so the world could keep working the way it always does for people who never saw anything out of place. The heaviest truth wasn't the body I found or the silence I chose. It was the way we, as humans, react when something slips outside our control. There's an almost automatic urge to name it, classify it, prove it, display it. When something doesn't fit our structures, the first instinct isn't respect, it's domination. It doesn't matter if that means destroying what was in balance, exposing what survived precisely because it stayed hidden, or turning something, living into an object of debate, curiosity, or power. Existence itself was never the biggest problem. The problem has always been what we do when we discover the world doesn't revolve around us. Over the years, I realized that death didn't represent the end of something extraordinary, but the direct consequence of an old pattern. A pattern that repeats whenever curiosity outweighs care, whenever the need to prove something is stronger than the ability to live alongside the unknown. The forest didn't fail. Silence didn't fail. What failed was the human insistence on crossing boundaries without accepting that some boundaries exist for a reason. That realization doesn't bring comfort. It doesn't bring moral superiority or easy answers. If anything, it unsettles you because it puts us at the center of the problem, not as victims of the unexplainable, but as agents of imbalance. It's easier to invent monsters than to accept responsibility. It's easier to mock an account than to think about the damage our actions cause. And maybe that's why stories like this get treated as exaggeration, as invention, as entertainment. That way, we don't have to face what they're really pointing to. What weighs most in that truth is realizing we don't learn from silence. We learn from repeating the mistake. Even when something disappears, even when the environment reacts, even when consequences spread slowly, we keep pushing forward, investigating, searching, demanding proof as if the world owes us explanations. And when something finally breaks, the surprise looks real, even though it was always coming. There's no heroism in this story, no clear victory, no full redemption. There's only the realization that some things survive precisely because they don't ask for attention, don't demand recognition, don't need to be understood to fulfill their place. When we force light onto everything, what we lose isn't just mystery. It's the balance that held it all together in silence. That's the part nobody wants to hear, because it demands a different kind of reflection. Not about what exists in the forest, but about what exists in us. About the urge to control, to prove, to turn everything into something useful, measurable, visible. Maybe the greatest danger was never what stayed hidden for so long, but our inability to live with what doesn't belong to us. If this kind of reflection grips you, the next video on your screen digs into another side of this same theme. It's not the same story, and it isn't a continuation, but it touches the same raw nerve. What happens when invisible structures, held up across generations, start getting pressed by curiosity, carelessness, and too much confidence? It's worth watching with that same attention, because they're different stories. But the unease they leave behind is the same. Maybe some things die not because they exist, but because we keep insisting on finding them.